Santa start a fire.
Hey church, my name's Rach and I'm part of the team here at Elevation Hills, and it's really exciting to be sharing with you today about Jesus feeding the 5,000 people that we read in the Gospel of John in chapter 6. But before we get started, I want to ask you a question. And that question is, have you ever had something, a physical thing or material thing, something that you've held on to that you thought, one day this will come in handy and one day I can use this, and opportunities keep coming up for you to use this thing, but you don't use it because you think that there's something else and something greater that you can use it for? So hold on to that question, but we're going to read through John chapter 6 together. So I'm going to read it out. So it starts off by saying, "Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up to a mountainside and sat down with the disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?' He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 'It would take more than half a year's wage to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite.' Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will that go among so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' There was plenty of grass in that place, and they all sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were there, and who were seated, as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over and let nothing be wasted.' So they gathered them and filled the 12 baskets with pieces of barley loaves that they had left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.' Jesus, knowing that they had intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself." So let's look at this story again. So we have Jesus here. He's just had a huge day of healing the sick and doing all these wonderful things. And it's the end of the day and all he wants to do is just go and hang out with his friends, his disciples, and retreat to a quiet place. And a crowd follows him. So it says that there were a crowd of 5,000 men. It doesn't actually say how many women or children were there with him, but this crowd follow him because they just want a glimpse of him and they just want to be in his presence. And the disciples say, "Jesus, we need to feed these people. You know, they're hungry and it's been a long day and we have to help them out, but we don't have anything here. Like, what can we do?" And, you know, this story was written over 2,000 years ago, and it's not like they had a corner store they could just duck down to down the road. You know, they didn't have Uber Eats or anything. They were actually on a mountain away from the village, so they didn't have any kind of food or resources with them. But they're presented with an opportunity of a little boy coming with some food, and Jesus blesses this food and feeds the crowd that's there, and they have 12 baskets left of food left over, which is absolutely insane and it's wild, and I actually can't comprehend what that would be like in person. But, you know, this story is so famous and it's such a great miracle story that we hear about time and time again. But the part that I want to drive home today and the part that I want to point out is the little boy with his food. The little boy that came with what he had in his hands, the small, the simple, and came and presented it, and God used that for a miracle. So when we look at that and we think about the little boy, it's actually quite countercultural for that time in that day and age. In Jewish culture, children were not very special. They weren't really significant. They were the lowest of the lows and the bottom of the food chain, and very overlooked and glanced over upon. And for this boy to come, you know, I imagine some of the other disciples would have pushed him aside and be like, "Little boy, like, sorry, please go away. We've got a big problem we've got to fill and we've got to solve, and you're being really distracting right now. Please go away." But one of the disciples sees that this boy came with the resources he had and thought that maybe this small thing could actually bless someone, and perhaps it could feed someone. Perhaps this could actually come to good use. And I think that so often we have that mindset of maybe what I have might not be enough, and I'm at the bottom of the food chain and I'm not that special or significant, and what I have to bring can't possibly benefit or impact someone else. But this story shows that God can use the simple and he can use the mundane and can use that for a miracle story. And I'm encouraged by this boy because he saw the resources he had, and he saw that what he had was indeed good enough, and what he had could make a difference. And, quite possibly we can make the impossible become possible. So I want to challenge you with what do you have in your hands, and what do you have that is small and insignificant and is obviously not good enough that God can use and can transform and can use that to bless someone else. Because I truly believe that there's power when we come to God with what we have, and when we're obedient with what he's given us, he can use that. And when we're faithful in our walk with Jesus and we love him and serve him wholeheartedly and with all our being, he's going to use that. And he's going to do things beyond our wildest imaginations. And especially when we come expectant, like this little boy, that's when God's Spirit moves. So a quick little story I want to share with you is, I remember growing up, and every year we would get new school shoes for the start of that year, and my mum would always keep the shoe boxes, and she'd always keep the empty box and put them aside in a cupboard because she knew that that would come in handy one day. And we'd always find that a bit strange and a bit weird, and most people would recycle those shoe boxes straight away, but she knew that there would always be an opportunity for that to serve a greater purpose. And so whenever we'd be doing arts and craft or anything and we didn't have enough with us to use, Mum would pull out the shoe boxes and we'd use that. Or if we needed extra storage for something, Mum would pull out the shoe box and use that to help. Or at the end of the year, when Operation Christmas Child would come along at school, and we'd need to put together Christmas gifts and send them overseas to help underprivileged kids and give them a blessing of a Christmas gift, we'd use that shoebox. Now, when you look at a shoebox, it's pretty boring and it's pretty plain and simple, and it's not very pretty or exciting, but there was opportunity time and time again to use that shoebox for a greater good and for a greater purpose. And by reading this story and thinking about that, I was struck by trying to think of how many times have I let opportunity pass me by, where I haven't used what God has given me and I haven't used the resources in front of me to bless someone else. And how many times have I let doubt or fear or unbelief overtake me because I've held on to the things I've had and I've thought God can't possibly use me and he can't possibly use the simple things that I have to transform and to change someone else's life. But there's so much in this story and so much we can learn from this little boy that we can apply to our own lives. And especially when we're obedient and when we're confident in God, and when we have faith that he can do the impossible, that's when his Spirit moves, and that's when miracles occur, and that's when things come to pass that's beyond what we could ever imagine. And God uses our faithfulness and he uses our obedience for his goodness and for his glory. And, we see that time and time again in Scripture. If we flip back, there's so many situations and there's so many people that, we can look at and think that they're quite boring or quite mundane, or they're, filled with shame or with guilt, or they're broken. But, time and time again, we look back and we see how God has used those situations and transformed those people and transformed that situation for his goodness and for his glory, and miracles occur time and time again, and we see how God takes the mundane and turns it into a miracle. So I want to encourage you that the impossible can become possible with God. And this little boy had a simple 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. He gave it to God and a miracle occurred. And God's always waiting to do a miracle. And if we're not faithful, if we're not ready, if we're not expectant, opportunities will pass us where God can move, and we don't want that to happen. We want God to do a miracle. So I pray that God opens your eyes to see what's in your hands that you can use, what can you give to Him. I pray that you're confident in God and that you have faith in God, and you might just be surprised what miracles God can do in your world. So let's be people who walk in faith, let's be people who are confident, and let's be people that have an abundance full and bags and baskets of leftover stories that we can share with our friends, with our family, of how God has done the impossible and made it possible, and how miracles have occurred in our worlds.